Right, I'm sorry about that little, and we've lost our screen. Never mind. Good evening and welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm John Sharp. I'm the chairman of Wanstead, Friends of Wanstead Parklands. Welcome to what is a repeat of the first of a series of talks on the history of Wanstead Park, being given by Richard Arnopp and hosted by the Friends of Wanstead Parklands. As I've said, please mute yourself and where possible turn off your video, and then as we go through the talk, if you have any questions, I'd be grateful if you could use the chat function to put them in there, and at the end of the talk Richard will respond to you. I'd like to say a couple of words about Richard. Apart from being an eminent historian of Wanstead Park, he also makes invaluable contributions to the running of the Friends in terms of our relationship with the City of London and in all the work that he does on Facebook and Twitter. He's a very valued member of our committee, and it's great to have him doing these talks for us. So thanks to all the members who have joined us this evening and for being members of Friends of Wanstead Parklands. If you are not a member yet, then please have a look at our membership page on the Friends of Wanstead Parklands website, and if you care to join us or make a donation, we'd be very pleased to have you with us. And with that, I will hand over to Richard and hope you enjoy the evening.
Thank you. I'll just start my slideshow. And share screen. And right, can we all see that?
Yes.
Good. Right, I'd like to follow John in welcoming you all here this evening. As you've heard, I'm Richard Arnopp, a member of the committee of the Friends of Wanstead Parklands, and this is a repeat of last week's introductory session in my series of talks on Wanstead Park's history. The genesis of these came late last year. I mooted the idea at a committee meeting as a way of promoting the park at a time when our activities as a group were severely curtailed by COVID restrictions. I dithered a while before taking the plunge, as I had no idea whether a series of online talks would attract enough of an audience to justify the effort. After all, the number of online events has exploded over the last couple of years. In the event, though, the response has been extraordinary. I gave the, could everyone mute, please? I gave the first 3 sessions a soft launch on social media, and this one, the first, was booked within hours. It was actually a bit embarrassing as we hadn't yet had a chance to notify our own members. So we organised tonight's repeat session mainly for them. That will be a one-off, as multiple iterations of the talks sadly aren't practical. However, they will be uploaded on a dedicated YouTube channel, and I've posted the address of that in the chat. So if you're interested, you could cut and paste that. That means anyone who can't make it to the live sessions will be able to view them at their convenience. And all you'll miss out on is being able to participate in the discussion at the end. Now, Now, tonight is partly going to be a taster for the park's history. So I'm going to outline the scope of this project, how I propose to tackle it, and why I'm presuming to do this at all. I'm also going to talk a little about the present day, who the Friends of Wanstead Parklands are, their aims, and how successful they've been. So let's start with the park itself. The park has three major aspects. It's a Grade 2 star listed historic landscape with important surviving features of a nationally significant 17th to 19th century landscape garden. I'll explain later what that means. The public park contains two separately listed buildings, both dating from about 1760. The temple, which now houses an intermittently open visitor centre, and a ruined boathouse grotto, seen a few years ago when the lake in front of it actually had water in it. This, by the way, is the grotto before it sadly burned down in the 1880s. In addition, St Mary's Church is Redbridge's only Grade 1 listed building. It's not technically part of the estate, but it was paid for largely by the owners of Wanstead House and was built to match the house, which was visible a couple of 100 yards behind it. Also, the former stables of Wanstead House, which are now occupied by Wanstead Golf Club. They are Grade 2 listed, as are a pair of gate piers on Overton Drive. This is one of them, which are maintained by Redbridge. Now, as well as being a historic landscape, the public areas are an important local amenity. Before lockdown, Wanstead Park had an estimated 200,000 visitors a year, making it one of Epping Forest's 8 most popular sites. That number has certainly gone up over the last couple of years. And the park is also a significant refuge for wildlife, particularly waterfowl. These three elements are in tension with each other, and its management rather resembles a troika with 3 horses all trying to pull in different directions. Consistently satisfying the demands of heritage, amenity, and nature is a problem, and compromises must be endlessly renegotiated. But I'll be coming back to the management of Wanstead Park later. First, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some significant historical highlights, which we'll be looking at in detail over the coming months. Now, Wanstead Park has a known history of occupation stretching back to the Bronze Age. These chaps are probably Iron Age, but I thought it was a nice picture. What we know and can infer about prehistoric occupation of the area will be the subject of my next talk, In the Beginning. For our purposes, the beginning will be the Anglian glaciation rather than the creation of the world, with a particular focus on the 10th and last human colonisation of this country after the last retreat of the glaciers, about 11,500 years ago. During the Roman period, Wanstead Park was the site of a settlement, probably a villa, which was discovered during landscaping work in 1715 and said to have been destroyed. We have a series of letters which shed tantalising but incomplete light on these discoveries. A Roman road, as you can see from this map, also ran through the western part of Wanstead Flats, and the Great Road to Colchester ran to the south. I've shown it here as crossing the southernmost fringe of Wanstead Flats. There is a possibility that it ran a little further to the south along what's now Romford Road, though I suspect the northern route is probably the correct one, as I'll explain in due course. When landscaping was carried out in the park, a mosaic was discovered, which from the description we have of it, may have been something like this. It sounds as if it depicted Bacchus riding on a panther. This is the centrepiece of the Leadenhall mosaic, which was found in the City of London round about 1800 and is now in the British Museum. Sadly, the Wanstead mosaic, we are told, was destroyed. Incidentally, it was through the archaeological project begun by the predecessor to the Friends group that I first became involved in the campaign for Wanstead Park.
And my sister's hat.
We don't know a lot about Saxon Wanstead, and it's first mentioned by name only in Domesday. After centuries of agricultural use, the central part of the manor of Wanstead was enclosed as a park shortly after 1499, when it was purchased by King Henry VII. There is some suggestion that the previous owner, Lady Hastings, had not been altogether willing to sell, but Henry was not a man to take no for an answer. Wanstead was at first used frequently by Henry and his successor as a country retreat and a base for hunting. It was placed under the control of a succession of keepers, including Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, who took the remarkably bold step of marrying Henry VIII's widowed sister Mary against the king's express instructions. Spoiler, they got away with it. After a period in which it seems to have fallen out of favour and the old manor house fell into disrepair, Wanstead passed out of royal ownership under Edward VI in the 1550s to Lord Richard Lees, who built a grand new house on a site to the north and east of the old one. This is a picture of the house as it was shortly before it was demolished, about 160 years later. This is a view from the rear. It was said at the time it was built to have been the biggest house in Essex. Now, if any of you have seen the film A Man for All Seasons, Richard Rich doesn't get a very sympathetic portrayal. The film's hero, Sir Thomas More, whom Rich betrayed, also had Wanstead connections, but that's a story for another time. The Tudor period house had a succession of prominent owners, including Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, Queen Elizabeth's doomed favourite, the Earl of Essex, Charles Blount, Earl of Devonshire, who defeated the Irish in the devastating 9 Years' War, James I's favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, who was later assassinated, Sir Henry Mildmay, who was imprisoned for life as a regicide, his son-in-law, Sir Robert Brooke, who mysteriously drowned in the River Rhone, and the Duke of York, later James II, who was destined to be deposed and exiled. And it's remarkable how many people associated with Wanstead came to bad ends one way or another. We know very little about the park in Tudor and Stuart times, except that the gardens round the house were relatively small and considered rather unremarkable. Now, that was to change after the Wanstead estate was purchased in the 1670s by the enormously wealthy merchant Josiah, later Sir Josiah Child. He extended the park to the west, incorporating the so-called New Park, access to which would later be the subject of litigation. However, his planting extended over vast areas of the manorial commons, which were thus transformed into an outpark, blurring the visual distinction between gardens, park, and outpark. So Josiah died in 1699, and his son Richard almost bankrupted himself, making a series of further huge changes. In the first place, from about 1706, the gardens were extended by George London to fill the entire enclosed area of the park. The elaborate Baroque layout, covering more than 300 acres, was one of the 3 largest gardens in the country and quickly became a magnet for tourists. Barely was it finished when fashions began to change and both house and gardens underwent further radical makeover. Now, these engravings give a very good impression of the grandeur and formality of the Baroque gardens, but they're not accurate in detail. And I'll be talking about that in a later session. But this gives you some idea of what they were like. And this is a great greenhouse, which was also built by Sir Richard Child, which doubled as a bathhouse. You can see the baths in one of the rooms on the plan. The Tudor house was torn down by 1715 to be replaced by the princely mansion designed by Scottish architect Colin Campbell, who was a protege of Lord Burlington. The new house took 7 years to complete, and Campbell was to be elbowed aside by William Kent, who replaced him as architect during the later stages of construction. This portrait actually hung in Wanstead House. Kent may also have an influence on the gardens, so conclusive evidence of that is lacking. There was an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum a few years ago in which items from Wanstead House, which were designed by Kent, were on display, including this settle, which I think is now at, it's either Wilton or Chatsworth. At the same time as the house was being rebuilt, the gardens were again redesigned, with the high maintenance fussiness of George London's design being simplified, and an elaborate chain of lakes being created around 3 sides of the park. This picture, which is attributed to Catton, shows the park as it was in about 1750. From 1750, the geometrical lines of the park were further softened, and much of it became more natural looking, in line with the prevailing English landscape style, which people associate with Lancelot Capability Brown, though he didn't work at Wanstead. However, some years later, in 1813, the man regarded as his successor, Humphrey Repton, did produce a series of proposals for the park, some of which were acted on. This is a banqueting house which stood on the Great Lake, on a peninsula in the Great Lake, in what's now the site of the Lake House estate. It stood until 1909, but was then demolished. This is one of Humphrey Repton's drawings for Wanstead, which is now at the Wormsley Library, owned by the Getty Foundation. Sadly, Wanstead House was due to be demolished only a few years later due to the extravagance of the last resident owner, William Wellesley Pole, a nephew of the Duke of Wellington, who married the heiress of the Child and Tilney families. This is the auction catalogue from the Great Sale of the contents of Wanstead House in 1822. This is a bicentenary. Wanstead Park was despoiled of its mature timber and any other saleable elements and let for grazing and rough shooting. The lurid saga of extravagance and bad behaviour which led to these events is grippingly told by local author Geraldine Roberts in her book The Angel and the Cad, which I thoroughly recommend. Many years into my involvement with Wanstead Park, I discovered that William Wellesley Pole was in fact a distant relative of mine, something like a ninth cousin 8 times removed. I also sat at primary school next to Geraldine Roberts, and such are the inscrutable workings of Providence. William's son, the 5th Earl of Mornington, was said to have toyed with the idea of restoring the house and estate, but died in 1863, aged 49, before anything was done. In 1882, his cousin and heir, Lord Cowley, sold most of the former pleasure gardens to the City of London, which added it to Epping Forest. So that's a very short summary of the park's history. So I'm going to talk briefly about why I'm doing this and what I bring to the party, so to speak. I should make it clear from the outset that I'm not an accredited historian. Though I've always been interested in history and archaeology, my professional background was in the civil service. I've known Wanstead Park since childhood, but when I became involved in the campaign for the park in 2007, my knowledge of it was fairly limited. However, the Wanstead Parklands Community Project, of which I'll be saying more later, was heavily focused on the park's history and its significance as a designed landscape. So I began reading my way into the subject as though I was learning a brief, pretty much as I had in the course of my work. Gradually, I began to undertake original research of my own and to write. I've had the good fortune over the years of coming in contact with many knowledgeable people, local historians, researchers, Epping Forest officers, landscape historians, consultants and others who've been generous to me with their time and expertise. So through them, I've achieved a degree of expertise by osmosis, as it were, and I'll try to give due credit to them individually as we go. As a researcher, I've tried not to spend too much time reinventing the wheel. A lot of important and reliable work has been and is being done by very capable people, and I'll be talking about that as we go. That said, it became apparent to me quite early on that there were some large gaps in our understanding of Wanstead Park's history and development. The late Donald Rumsfeld famously said, "There are known knowns, there are things we know we know. There are also we also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. Wanstead Park indeed has its share of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, but more insidiously, there are also a fair number of things we assumed we knew because they were endlessly repeated, but which closer examination has shown to have been based on Chinese whispers, misunderstandings, or even in a couple of cases, outright fabrication. And that is true of a couple of the best known stories about the park. The mission I set myself has been to focus on the shadowy areas where serious research has been lacking. And these are the things I've spent the last 15 years worrying away at. I'll run through a selection of the work I've done. I've attempted to collect, collate, and make sense of past archaeological work on the site, a thing which is much easier said than done. I've also flagged up the potential for new projects using LiDAR and historic aerial photography, for example, which, when it eventually implemented using funding from Historic England, yielded very useful results. I've created a very large collection of historic images, postcards, original photographs, artworks and objects which illustrate the past appearance of Wanstead Park and Wanstead Flats, their maintenance and changing policies concerning their use. Building on the work of the late Alan Cornish, I've studied the history of the water supply to Wanstead Park, the evolution of the lakes and possible causes of the problems they've experienced from 1900 onwards. I've studied the temple, which I identified as a former estate menagerie building. This is one of the birds that was kept there, as well as other structures such as the remains of walls, dams, and unrecorded bridges. I've studied the evolution of the landscape, commenting in detail on the important but sometimes misleading evidence of historic plans and images. I've demonstrated that Humphrey Repton's 1813 plans for Wanstead Park were implemented only very selectively. Lewis Kennedy's 1818 proposal to recast the American garden northeast of the house was never implemented at all. I've sought to demonstrate the potential of non-British sources, French, Italian, German, Hungarian, to shed light on the history of Wanstead Park, which was one of the major tourist sites of the 18th and early 19th century. This is an extract from the diary of Count Ferenc Széchenyi, describing his visit to the grotto in 1787. I've researched the life and activities of John, 2nd Earl Tilney, both in Britain and Italy, and sought to demonstrate his important contributions to the development of the park. Strangely, nobody else seems ever to have looked at the occupation of Wanstead House between 1802 and 1810 by members of the exiled French royal family, or the politically significant events which took place there during that time. In cooperation with other researchers, such as Tim Cousins, who was present at the last iteration of this talk, I've looked at the life of the 5th Earl of Mornington, and we've jointly reached some interesting conclusions about why he disinherited his sister, Lady Victoria Long Wellesley, at his death in 1863, and made his cousin Lord Cowley his heir. As it was Lord Cowley who reached a deal with the City of London in 1880 over Wanstead Flats and Wanstead Park, that's rather important to the story. Now, I haven't listed these things on the assumption that my work has been the last word on these matters, or even that I've necessarily been the best person to undertake it. I would only comment that nobody else has. I hope it will at least reassure you, though, that if you stick with me over the coming journey, you won't just be presented with a bunch of rehashed material which you could have dug out for yourselves. Some of you who live in Wanstead will be aware of a monthly series of articles, which I wrote some time ago for the Wanstead Village Directory. This one is about the occupation of the Prince de Condé, the cousin of King Louis XVIII, whose portrait you can see in the corner. This series ran for about 2 years and was a chronological history focusing on the owners and tenants of Wanstead Park. I'll be covering much of that ground again in these talks, but with new content, as I'm not constrained here by word counts or page formats. However, I've called this series Wanstead Park in Context because from time to time there'll be digressions as I pause to expand on wider themes which will have a bearing on the story. To give just one example, it's widely known that much of the wealth which funded the rebuilding of Wanstead House and the successive remodelings of the gardens in the 18th century came ultimately from Sir Josiah Child's involvement in the East India Company. So, what was the East India Company? And what was the Royal Africa Company, with which Wanstead's owners actually had a rather longer relationship? These are interesting questions, and following the money will provide us with abundant material for discussion some way down the line. As we approach the present, I'm also in a position to offer an inside view of the campaign to address the park's extensive, significant problems, as Historic England has described them, and the work which has been done by the park stakeholders to develop plans for its restoration and future maintenance, and what they've already done as they begin to implement them. I'll be summarising that in the latter part of tonight's talk. So at this point, I'll define what Wanstead Park is today. There are actually 4 current entities which share the same name. The first and smallest is the area covered by the Wanstead Park bylaws, which are slightly different from those of Epping Forest. This in turn is part of the public park, which is 167 acres of publicly accessible forest land managed by the Corporation of London as part of Epping Forest. The Wanstead Park Conservation Area, notified under the Planning Act 1990, was set up by the London Borough of Redbridge to protect the character of an area totaling 299 acres, including the public park, the golf course, and residential housing in Overton Drive. Then there's the area registered as a Grade 2 style listed park and garden of special historic interest by English Heritage. This extends to 399 acres, which includes the public park, the golf course, the sports grounds, Bushwood, and Wanstead Flats west of Lake House Road. Now, these various entities comprise elements of the historic park, the enclosed part of which came to cover about 300 acres, and as I've mentioned, had a landscaped out park extending over a much wider area. About a third of the former park and much of the out park have been lost to development, but fragments of the latter with traces of planting do still survive. Now, to add to the complexity, the registered landscape, on which I'll be focusing for most of the time, has 4 landowners. These are 1, the Corporation of the City of London, which is custodian of much the largest part of the registered historic park, including the public park, Bushwood, and the western flank of Wanstead Flats. 2. Wanstead Sports Association Limited, which consists of the golf club, cricket club, bowls club, and tennis club. 3. Wanstead Parish, which is responsible for St Mary's Church, with the London Borough of Redbridge being responsible for the maintenance of the closed burial ground. And 4. The privately owned Blake Hall Club. Incidentally, it was to sidestep these issues of definition and ownership that our group adopted the name Friends of Wanstead Parklands. We're concerned with the historic park, parts of which are now built up, and all the surviving open spaces within or adjacent to or historically linked to it. Now, I ended the historical overview with the purchase of the site by the City of London in 1880. So, why the City of London? During the 19th century, the city survived the dissolution of all other ancient corporations by reinventing itself. One of the things it did was to become a focus of philanthropic activity. It was able to do this by deploying the extensive resources which it had inherited and continued to generate as landlord of some of the world's most valuable real estate. One of the early areas in which the city was particularly active was in assisting local campaigns to resist the development of a number of important green spaces around London. Several of these were later to be acquired with parliamentary assistance. The city's portfolio of open spaces now accounts for about 35% of all the open spaces in the London area, and it's probably the most visible and popular element of the city's charitable outreach. Epping Forest, which you can see here, was acquired in a complex process which culminated in the Epping Forest Act of 1878, which prescribed how the forest was to be protected and also rationalised its governance. A second act in 1880 built on this and paved the way for an acquisition of Wanstead Park, and also specified additional powers in relation to the management of enclosed ornamental landscapes. Following improvements, Wanstead Park opened to the public in 1882. The remaining portion of the pleasure gardens around the house site was leased to and then purchased by Wanstead Golf Club. Some outlying areas to the north and south were sold off by the Wellesley family and developed for housing after about 1900. For several decades, Wanstead Park was improved and managed fairly intensively in a municipal style, helped by the funding which Parliament had made available to the city through the Mettage-on Grain Act of 1872. The Act was time limited to 30 years, and its expiry in 1902 unfortunately coincided with the escalation of long-term problems in the park, which have had no permanent resolution to this day. After 1902, the city lost a major income stream, which had been substantially devoted to land acquisition and management. As a result, it became less willing to commit to large-scale capital projects, and expenditure on maintenance also gradually came under pressure. This has been the context for the subsequent decline of Wanstead Park. To make matters worse, bomb damage to the Heronry Pond in the Second World War was never successfully repaired. After the war, the refreshment chalet was not replaced when it burned down, and the later adoption of one forest policy as it was termed, saw the scaling down of preferential treatment for the Wanstead Park landscape, even though this was specifically provided for under the 1880 Act. By the 1970s, the increasingly dismal state of the park, with the Heronry Pond much of the time being empty, was giving rise to increasing local concern. The late Alan Cornish, a businessman and local politician, was co-author of a paper about the state of the Heronry Pond, which galvanised discussion of that problem and continued to be regarded as a key resource for many years. Alan also founded the Friends of Wanstead Parklands in 1981 to campaign more generally for the park's restoration. In 1987, Wanstead Park was listed as a Grade 2 star landscape, placing it in the top 5th of all registered landscapes. This generated a brief but important flurry of activity by Epping Forest, notably the commissioning of the Du Bois Report, a brilliant piece of work by John Phibbs, who went on to become a major figure in the field of landscape history. The original incarnation of the Friends became dormant after about a decade of activity, but a new campaign was founded by the late Stuart Munro in 2005. The Wanstead Parklands Community Project was an ad hoc committee of about a dozen people, mostly local and of recognised standing in various fields, or with particular skills. The community project, which I joined a couple of years later, generated a good deal of publicity and successfully completed an HLF-funded project focusing on education and raising awareness of the park's significance. In 2009, it was instrumental in securing the park's addition to Historic England's at-risk register. As well as highlighting Wanstead Park's poor condition, the community project regarded this as a prerequisite for securing HLF funding to help secure its restoration. Someone needs to mute themselves. At Epping Forest's suggestion, the community project sponsored the reactivation of a broad-based Friends group in 2008, initially under Alan Cornish's chairmanship, and suspended its own separate operations 4 years later. Since 2010, the Friends have cooperated with the City of London in formulating long-term plans for Wanstead Park's regeneration and restoration. The Friends now have several hundred subscribing members and thousands of followers on social media. Of Wanstead Park's 4 custodians, the Friends have mainly focused their lobbying on the City of London. Amicable relationships have been established with the others, but the areas in their care don't present issues of major concern at present. The Friends of Wanstead Parklands are well aware of the city's huge and varied commitments and the particular challenges that Wanstead Park presents. They took the view from the outset that the city's acceptance of the need to restore and more actively manage the park was a major step forward in itself that deserved to be built on and encouraged. The Friends also accepted that any plans for the park's restoration and future management would require preparatory work to fill knowledge gaps and formulate a coherent, workable, and properly costed scheme. Since 2010, a very comprehensive conservation statement has been followed by a series of mostly very valuable specialist reports, funded mostly by the city and in 1 or 2 cases by Historic England. The Friends, who have members with expertise in the fields of history, ecology and park management, have made a constructive contribution to most of these. The Parkland Plan, setting out principles and priorities for the restoration and future management of Wanstead Park was finally adopted by the Epping Forest and Commons Committee in 2019. The estimated cost of its implementation in full at that time was about £15 million. For a time, things looked very positive. A viable route to funding the park's restoration seemed to have been identified. Within the city, interest in and even enthusiasm for the Wanstead Park project seemed to be growing. However, since then, two spanners have been thrown into the works. Firstly, the funding model for the parkland plan collapsed, as I will explain in detail in a later talk. Secondly, uncertainties arising from the economic consequences of COVID-19 caused the emergency brake to be applied to all but the most essential City of London expenditure. All this has been a bit of a roller coaster. However, until the dust clears after COVID, momentum is being kept going with a series of smaller projects and a general scaling up of maintenance. The cumulative impact to date has been significant, and some quite exciting work has been embarked on, such as projects at the Grotto. So that's where we are. The present Wanstead Park project has now been a decade in duration. Much useful work has been done in preparing the ground for Wanstead Park's restoration and future management. We are living through a time of economic uncertainty which has impacted heavily on the City of London's finances. In these circumstances, it's entirely reasonable that the city should impose a moratorium on discretionary spending for a limited period. However, Wanstead Park isn't going away. Its condition will not improve spontaneously. Sooner or later, one way or another, the nettle of restoring it must be grasped, and we are not going away. I hope that's been of some interest. I'd be very happy shortly to take your questions and observations. I'll just run through a few slides showing the historic landscape before we finish. Right, I'll turn off my slideshow.
Richard, thank you very much for that illuminating talk. I'll just put this on, and then we'll get into the questions. Okay, so from the top, apologies to anybody who didn't hear our announcement at the beginning of the talk and who thought they may be able to sort of stop the show and ask a question through the chat. I'm afraid it was always designed that questions would be at the end of the talk, and it's not entirely practical to just pick them up on the go. So, Richard, first question I have here. Do you know how or why was the Roman mosaic destroyed?
Well, the account we have in a letter by the neighbouring landowner, Smart Letellier, he said that the owner of the park had no taste for such things. The workmen who found the mosaic let him know what they'd found. They were digging an avenue, digging holes for an avenue of trees at the time, and he wasn't interested, and he told them to just carry on doing what they've been told to do.
Okay, so a bit of a even possibly. But there's a question here from Ashfaq. Ashfaq, if you're still with us and can unmute yourself, I don't quite understand what you're asking in your question. So if you'd like to ask Richard, if you're still here. No, he isn't. Okay, I'll continue down the list.
Oh, I think Ashfaq is probably asking about the sudden change of names in the family who owned the park. Well, what happened was that in the 1730s, Sir Richard Child had inherited a great deal of money and further landed estates from his wife's uncle, whose name was Tilney. And the price of accepting these legacies was that he changed his family name to Tilney. So he and his eldest son changed their name from Child to Tilney. The second son, Josiah Child III, didn't bother, and he continued to live under his birth name. Sorry, I was trying to cover a lot of ground in a short time. I hope that's clearer.
Okay, thanks, Richard. The next question is from Karina, who says, regarding the grotto, could you discuss the scope of the planned restoration works and how much will be restored and recreated? On the previous talk, we had one of the birders, Nicholas Monday, who sort of answered that question. Do you want to take it, Richard, or shall I?
Yes. Basically, the idea is to restore the facade of the grotto as far as possible to its original appearance, and only do such work to the rest of the remains of the building as are necessary to stabilize it at this stage. The principle's been adopted that nothing should be done that would preclude a fuller restoration of the grotto at a later stage. But that's what's budgeted for at the moment, restoration of the facade. Large amounts of fallen rock work have been retrieved from in and around the lake. That's being sorted, and using photographic evidence, it will be replaced as far as possible as it was.
Yes, we're advised that the work on the canal, the boat canal leading into the grotto to stabilize it, will be commencing on March the 14th, and this is due to funding received from the Heritage of London Trust and applied for by ourselves. There's a hand up from Carol Curtis. I don't know, Carol, whether you can unmute and ask your question.
Sorry, I don't know how that's happened. I haven't got a question to ask.
It happens to us all, Carol.
It actually says I'm in safe driving mode, so I don't know what I've done. So I'm just listening. Ignore me.
Okay. All right.
Right. I noticed somebody asks, what does the Count's letter say? This is Count Sacheny. I've translated all his notes about Wanstead House and the gardens and posted it on our webpage. So you would find it there. If you search on 1787, I'm sure you'll find it.
Thanks, Richard. I'm not seeing any more questions up here, so
I can see several.
can you? Okay, well, I don't know what happened with mine.
Can you please repeat the name of the book you recommended? That was The Angel and the Cad by Geraldine Roberts.
I think it's best you read your own questions, Richard. I don't seem to have any more, or can't get to them.
Yes. Ashfaq asks another question which I can't guess at. Map.
Oh, right. Can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Oh, no,
Yes.
because when you moved from one description and you're talking about the 4 pieces of land and the various ownerships, I think you still had the article with the French aristocrat. So at that point, it would have been good to have the PowerPoint presentation of the map so that we could see exactly which parcel of land you were describing.
Oh, okay. I've now closed down my presentation, which was a bit silly of me. I'll see if I can find it again.
Well, in answer to the questions about the book, the latest advice that we have on that is that it will be published at the beginning of March. It has been proofread. Liverpool University Press are publishing, I believe, 500 copies, of which a lot of them are pre-orders. We're expecting there to be a launch of the book. This is called East London's Lost Palace by Dr. Hannah Armstrong at the Wanstead Library in March. I haven't had absolute confirmation, but this is what we're expecting right now. So a question from Michelle Harris about what projects are coming up regarding the park. Strangely, we, when I say we, I mean the Friends of Wanstead Parklands, we have a meeting with Epping Forest in just 2 days' time to discuss how we work with them to basically try and attract more funding. So there are various funds available for various purposes in the park, some for nature, some for history, some for landscape, and we are aiming on developing a strategy with them to get funding. There's also, we recently heard that a grant has become available from the London Borough of Redbridge, which is part of their, they call SANGS application, which is, I think, a special area of natural, let's just leave it at SANGS. So we believe that there will be quite a lot of money, and I think we're talking about £30,000 for the development or the improvement of paths at the called the Reservoir Path, which is at the back of the Heronry Pond. You will also probably have heard about the play area, which is now has some funding, but we're waiting to hear back from the Central Grant Programme, which is run by the City of London, and also there's a crowdfunding which is about to be launched to get additional funding for that. I think that's about as much as I can tell you at the moment.
Right, okay. I'm just going to share my screen briefly again. I've had a couple of requests for things that I showed during the talk. Okay, let's do that.
While you're doing that, Richard, there's a question here from Jane saying, is it possible to get a copy of the map of the proposed work to be done? Jane, if you can unmute yourself and perhaps give us a little bit more information about that question, it would be helpful. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the proposed work.
The one that was shown with details at the side about what has been agreed to be done if funds become available, which obviously they're not at the moment. I've just wondered
Ah.
if that's online or somewhere you can actually read the details of it.
Yes, it is. The Parkland Plan is now a public document since it's been adopted by the City of London. I will post a link to it on Facebook. Are you on Facebook?
Yes, indeed.
Are you a member of our group?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I will do that after the talk, and then you can browse through the whole thing. That was just an example of one of the maps from that.
Thank you.
Now, I assume everyone's had enough of the map of the registered landscape now. So I will go on to the other request I had, which was the Wanstead Village Directory article. Here we are.
Is it possible to actually get that as a hard copy somewhere?
Well, I don't know if it's possible to get it as a hard copy, but the texts and a selection of the images are available online. The whole series is still there on the Wanstead Village Directory website.
Thank you. That's what yeah.
I think their PDF archive doesn't go back quite as far as that, though I may be wrong. They changed their website some time ago, and I think it may have gone by the board. But yeah, the content is still there.
Richard, another question has come up, and I presume it refers to the holding slide that you had with all the little bits of pottery fragments. Jill is asking, where does that one come from?
What, this one?
I'm assuming that's what you mean. Yeah.
Well, it's actually painted wall plaster from the Roman presumed villa. So there we are. A huge quantity of painted plaster was found starting in fairly small scale excavations in the 60s, but much more of it was found in the 1980s. There was a pit north of the Perch Pond where large quantities of Roman rubble and plaster had been dumped. And you know, this is pretty high quality stuff. So you can see that this was quite a high status building. The fact that it had figurative mosaics as well, which were very expensive, shows that somebody very wealthy lived there.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I can't see any more questions. Are you able to tell us anything more about your second talk that you're doing?
Well, not really beyond what I said. It's about prehistory, mainly from the end of the last glaciation up to the end of the Iron Age with the Roman invasion. I'm trying to get my Zoom page back.
Okay. All right. Well,
I'm an old person. I struggle with the technology.
okay. Well, I think we've probably reached the end of the course of the questions and answers and of your talk, Richard. So on behalf of everybody, thank you. Thank you very much. And
well, we were just going to ask people the question of where they heard about this. I assume it was mostly from social media or our own membership list. Were there any other places just through Eventbrite, or people could give some indication in the chat perhaps if they heard about it in other ways?
okay, we've got a few answers coming up.
Which I can't see because I still can't get my
Okay,
Zoom
so
page back.
Facebook, word of mouth, Barra,
Go on.
village directory. Oh, lost Richard. Okay.
I found you again. I've managed to get back in.
And we've got somebody from Tennessee.
Oh, wonderful. Welcome. Why are you here as a matter of interest? Interest in landscape history, connection with England, or?
Okay.
Well,
Event guide here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Well, there you go.
Well, welcome, Alison, wherever you're here.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks very much again, Richard.
Yeah, I'm just scrolling back through the chat. Is there anything I've missed? What projects are coming up? We sort of answered that. Oh, has anyone received the Wanstead House book? It's just in the process of being printed. This is Dr. Hannah Armstrong's new book.
Richard, I did answer that one.
Oh, did
so
you? Right. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd hoped you might show is the set of the house drawings at the beginning. They moved quite quickly. I think I missed the middle one. And I was quite interested. I hadn't seen all of those.
Okay, well,
if it's possible, if it's not, it's okay.
There are 6 of them in the set. By the middle one, do you mean the cross section of the house?
No, it was the one. It was before it. Before the one with the bath.
Ah.
I don't know.
Oh, right.
They seem to move quite quickly.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Let's. Am I still screen sharing? Right. Let's go through those again from the current slide. Right. That's a view to the east. And although the park has been deformalised since then, the main axis from the house down toward what's now the ornamental water is still there.
Richard,
it's not screen sharing.
Oh, right. Okay. Let's try again. How's that?
Yeah, that's it. Well, yeah, you're there, nearly there.
Okay, so that's a view to the east. Along the park's main east-west axis, which still exists. This is the Elizabethan house down at the bottom. And this is a view to the west. Again, you can see the house roughly to the centre with the 2 semicircular ponds, which were later combined into the new octagonal lake that we call the Basin, and then the view onto Leytonstone. On the top left, you can see the City of London with the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral and the monument. Now, as I said when I was going, these particular set of engravings are false friends in some ways because they are not accurate in detail. They deliberately exaggerate the size of the landscape, and certain things are changed about. Details are invented, so you have to treat them with a degree of caution, but they do give an overall impression of what the park was like. This is the last in the set, the view to the north, which is in 2 halves. You can see the old St. Mary's Church, which stood about 70 feet to the south of the present one, up in the top left-hand corner. The great greenhouse, and a little banqueting house, which was over one of the avenues leading down to the bowling green. So is that enough? Are you happy with that? The lady who asked?
Yes, thank you very much.
Right, okay. So anything else before I hand back to John?
Thinking not.
I think we're there.
I think we're done. Okay.
I hope we'll see you next time.
Yep. Thank you very much, everybody. It's great to have
Thank
you
you.
with us, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you.